This tutorial is part of our full-stack React Django DRF channels project, DJ Chat. You can watch this tutorial and many more from our YouTube course playlist, or the whole course, including access to additional resources from our Udemy course. The Udemy course link, which provides the best price for the course, is in the video description. This section of the course, we're going to focus in on actually building these components, extracting the data from our API so that we can populate the templates that we created in the previous section. So we're going to concentrate on building this explore system, which is the service whereby users can select different categories. You can see then the channels related to those categories, the servers related to those categories will then be shown here in the main section. Users will be able to select those, and that will then take them to the server homepage. In this case, that's going to be the chat interface. Right, so before we get started, let's just make sure we have a grasp, or just to recap, how to actually control, manage the servers, both now the React server and the Django server. So we're going to need to be able to we're going to need to learn, if we don't already know how to, actually activate the two servers so they're working concurrently. That makes it sound really complicated. We basically just need to turn on both servers so that when we're actually extracting data from our API, of course, that server needs to be turned on so we can actually utilize the Django API that we created. So let's, I'm just going to Control-C that to come out of the React server there and just clear that. Right, so first of all, let's just make sure we know where we are. So I'm just going to cd back into the main directory. That's the root directory here. So just going to close this up. So I'm now in this root directory. Typically that's the directory that is activated, or that's a directory that you start off with when we start the project. Notice that we've got the DJ Chat folder here and the React Chat to correspond to the front and back end. So you can see in the list here when I type in ls, oh, actually, I'm in the wrong folder still. There we go. So now I'm in the right place. Apologies. And you can now see those folders which correlate to this directory. So I need to make sure that I have a server started for both the React application and the Django application when I'm working here, because like I said, we're going to make a request from the React application, an API request, over to our API to actually extract data from the Django application. Right. So let's first cd into DJ Chat, and here we can just type in manage.py and then run server. There we go. So later on in this course, we will be using a different server for our Django application. Once we start to implement the chat application, start utilizing channels. But for now, that's okay. Now notice here that I already have, it looks like a server running. So I'm just going to close that because I showed you the preview there. So I need to just make sure that's turned off, and then I've got the server running. So the server is now running. So I can go ahead and just open up a new window, and now I can cd into React Chat, and then go ahead and npm run dev. So both servers are now running, and that's the state we want to be in when we develop in this section of the course. So now we have these servers running. In this tutorial, we're going to install Axios and create our first API request. So I'll make the assumption that you haven't used Axios before. If you have, then just go ahead and install Axios, maybe move to the next section. But for those who haven't, I'm going to quickly show you how to install Axios and create a new API request. It is worth noting that we don't need to utilize Axios, which is a popular JavaScript library that allows us to make HTTP requests from our web browser. We can use JavaScript. That will do just the same. But utilizing Axios, it provides various features which will extend or advance features from the built-in method. So Axios supports various features such as sending get, post, put and delete requests. So these are all different types of requests that we might want to send to the back end, depending on what type of actions we want to perform. So for example, if we are going to be just getting data from the API, if we're requesting data, then we're going to send a get request. if we're, for example, sending data to the API to save into a database, we're going to be sending a post request. So these type of requests are important to learn. So if you are new to API or HTML in general, learning get, post, put, and delete is something that you can have a quick read around. So to use Axios, all we need to do is install, and then we'll just take you through a basic request cycle. So we'll make a get request, we'll then handle a successful response, and then, for example, just quickly show how to maybe handle an error. Right, so back into our application. First of all, let's just stop, pause, terminate the React server there so we can go ahead and actually install Axios. So if you type in npm Axios, that would take you over to the library here, and we can have a look at how to install Axios. So I can just press that. That copies to the clipboard there. You can see it's a very popular tool. Weekly downloads, 43 million. So it's very popular indeed. Right, so let's go back to the code here. Let's go ahead and install. Right, so with that installed, let's go into our React application here. Let's go into the pages, and we go to the home page, and let's remember that we have, for example, well, let's focus first on the primary drawer. So let's go into the templates, primary drawer. Bring this down a little bit. Actually, we'll show the example on the secondary drawer first, because we'll just go ahead and grab, for example, all the categories. So what we're going to do here is we're going to send or create a GET request using Axios to actually return all of the categories from our backend API, our Django REST framework API, and then just display them in the console. Just to give you a flavor, just give you an idea of how to utilize Axios to actually return data from the API. Right, so within this secondary drawer, now we aren't going to be working directly in this secondary drawer in the future, but we're just going to set up this example, and then we go ahead and remove it. So let's go ahead and import Axios. So import Axios from Axios. There we go. So that will then import an instance of Axios, and then we can utilize that to actually make a GET request. Right, so down here, let's go ahead and make a GET request. So we're going to use Axios dot, and then we're going to use a GET. So GET and POST are probably the most two popular HTTP methods used for sending requests to the server. So GET is used to retrieve data from the server, whereas POST is used to send data to the server to create or update a resource. So to send a request, we are going to need to know the actual endpoint. So that's going to be http:// and then we're going to need to know the endpoint for our server. So let's just familiarize ourselves again with the backend, because it's been a few tutorials since we were working on the backend. Now we have, I'm just going to move to the other terminal here. We have the server running. So let's just go back into the terminal here, and we just need to remind ourselves. So the server, and then we're going to need to remind ourselves of the URL. So in actual fact, it's DJ chat the URLs. So this is where we're going to find server select. Okay. So we don't actually have potentially the capabilities of returning the categories, which is an oversight potentially. So let's go into server, let's go into views, category. Okay, so in actual fact, we can't return all the categories, so it's irrelevant. We need to add that in probably shortly, but let's just utilize what we have here. So we have created a way of returning a list of all the servers. So let's try and actually return these servers related to maybe a particular category. So let's just remind ourselves then on how to actually access that documentation. So that's API doc schema UI. And this is where it comes in useful, because I've already forgotten how to access that. So the documentation is going to be really useful for us to then just remind ourselves. So we want to access the documentation. and then go over to server. I'll quickly have a read through this again, just to remind myself this is what it's for. And then I can start to use these endpoints. So what I want to do is try this out. Let's go for this. And so we want to access by category, category to serve. So I think I called it category 1, category 2, etc. So I'm going to return all these servers related to a particular category. So I'm going to execute that. And you can see I don't actually return anything, suggesting that maybe there isn't any data. So maybe I need to add some data. So let's go ahead and do exactly that. So let's go into here. And let's go into the admin. And let's take a look to see if we actually have any data. So category, we've got category 2 because we deleted a category, I think, previously. So let's just make sure that there is some data here. Let's go back into the endpoint and let's change this to category 2. Execute that. And this time it looks like we've got some sort of error. No such column, server channel.banner. Looks like we've got some sort of error here. Now that may be related to the fact that I haven't actually migrated. So there's a little bit of work here we need to do. Okay, so let's just turn off this server. Apologies for this state. Let's just make sure, right? So we've got this issue here. We're not too sure what's happened. So let's just compact back down. Let's go into the server. Let's just, first of all, let's remove the database. And then what we'll do after that, that's popped up. Let's go into the server. Let's go into migrations. Let's just remove the migrations. We're doing this manually. And then we'll probably need to, React keeps popping up there. That's annoying. Then we need to go into the account migrations. We need to also delete that initial migration. So we're just resetting everything. Again, I don't know why that's, because that's open, that's why. Okay, right, so that's account. So I've gone into accounts, I've gone into server, media, that's absolutely fine. Right, so I've gone into server and account, I've gone into the migration and just deleted the migration files. Don't delete the initialization file. Important to keep that in, or anything else, or the migration folder. So we don't want to remove those. So I've gone ahead and deleted the server, I've deleted the migration file. So that's pretty much reset everything here in the Django environment. So what I can now do is just initialize everything again. So let's go for manage.py, make migrations. That's going to then set out a migration file. So I can then migrate that to the servers. And let's go ahead now and migrate that. Sorry. There we go, migrate. So everything is fine there. So what I need to now do is manage.py, and I'll bring this up a bit. I keep forgetting, apologies, because, oh, actually I'll clear that, because I realize that some of you might have subtitles and that might be getting in the way. Right, so manage.py, and now what we need to do is create a super user. So we've got a new user, admin. We don't need an email address. Admin, you can't see it, but it's there when you type it in. And now I can go ahead and just start the server up again. Run server. So let's go back into the admin here. And let's go ahead and just add a new category. Remember, the category needs to be added first because of all of the different dependencies. So let's just call this cat1. Okay, so we won't worry about icons for now. We'll do that shortly. So let's save that. And let's now build a new server, just so we've got some data. So server 1, owner, category, cat, descriptions, and then a member. Press save. Right, so we've got some data. So we don't need to add particularly any more, but we've got some data. Let's just test this out. So we'll execute that with cat1. And now you can see we return some data. That's all we're going to need for this demonstration. So let's go back to the front end. So just make sure that you're in the right terminal here. So I've just switched terminals. You can right click and rename. So maybe I'll just call this one React, for example, and then rename this one to Django DRF. And that identifies the different terminals that can help out. So let's jump back into the React section. Let's make sure we're in the React app. Let's go back to the SRC page, and we were in the themes and secondary drawer. So we've already created we've already imported Axios. We've started to create our HTTP request. Now, the reason why we did this was so that we could get this endpoint here, because that's the request URL that we want to make a request to. Now, this might be done dynamically ultimately, but for now, we're just going to create this fixed HTTP, get this right, fixed URL, sorry, there. So that will then be directed, to our API at that point to collect all the categories that begin with category 1 or related, to category 1. God, got to warm up the brain again here. Right, so that is going to then send a request to the API endpoint, which is going to request all these servers related to category 1. So that's the request. Right, so once we've created this request, we then want to perform some sort of action potentially. So we use this dot notation. Then we want to grab the response. I think I need a coffee. Right, so we've got a response, and then we can console.log that out for now. Response.data. Okay, so we're going to grab the data from that response, and that then finishes. And then what we can also do is we can also catch any errors. I'm just zooming in a little bit. It is quite small. Catch any errors. So error is the arrow notation there, catch, and then we can console.log the error for now. Okay, there we go. So we don't need to do anything else. Let's just go ahead and npm run npm run dev. Okay. Right, so let's do a quick refresh. Let's open up the terminal console, and then let's take a look. And you can see here that we get an error. Good. So we were expecting an error, so don't worry. If you are receiving an error, there is a particular reason for that, and that's because of the cause policy. So we are actually sending a request over, but you can see that the request is being blocked because of something called the cause policy. Access control allowed origin header is present on the requested resource. So I will explain cause policy or cause in the next tutorial, but let's remember that I did push some people who didn't want to go through this process over to a next tutorial. So I will quickly just resolve this problem, take you through how to resolve this problem. But like I said, I will follow that up in the next tutorial and give you a little bit more in-depth information in regards to the cause policy in the next tutorial. So let's just resolve this problem. Now, let's just briefly describe why we're having this problem. We're having this problem because notice here that we're using localhost 5173. So we have the URL being localhost or 127.0.0.1. So local loopback address we're using here, and the port number. If we go back into the terminal and have a look at what Django is using, Django is using port 8000. So we're using this here, 127.0.0.1 8000. Now, because they do not match, it means that the browser and the server won't allow us to actually send a request over to the server, and the server won't respond to it. Now, that statement is super summarized, but that's essentially what's happening here. Because the server is running on a different port number or IP address or domain name than the front end, it means that the server will simply just reject any requests from the front end unless it was on the same domain and port number. So if we did actually run React on the same, in this case, the loopback address here and the same port, which we can't obviously do, then we wouldn't have this problem. Now, this is something that is relevant on every single website, regardless whether you're working locally or whether you're actually deploying your application, this will be relevant. So cause is something that's actually built into the browser, which prevents some types of security problems or help protect against some security threats, which again, we'll learn in the next tutorial, but I just wanted to summarize it here. So just to summarize then, in order for this to work, we need to make sure that either the React and Django application is running on the same domain name, for example, and port, or else we need to tell Django here in the backend that it's okay to accept requests from other domains or from other IP address and port numbers. So what we're going to need to do to solve this very quickly is to type in Django cores headers. That would take us then to PyPy Django core headers. We need to then just go ahead and pip install this. So make sure you're in the right console here. This is the Django console. So we'll just pip install Django core headers. There we go. And now we can go ahead and make some changes here in our Django application. So what we do is we'll go into DJ chat and settings. Just bring this down a bit. If we take a look at the documentation, we're told that we need to add that into the installed apps as well as add it as middleware. So let's just do that first. So it's an external app, so add that in. Don't need that. And then we just need to make sure that the core headers are in the middleware, and that's above the common middleware. So it's important that we add this in the right place. Remember what's happening here is that when we make a request, data's coming in, and it's from the top, it's then going to go through all this middleware. So it's important that it's in the right order so that the functionality is conducted first before the common middleware. So we just add it right there. Then show me again. There we go. So now we can add a customization to allow Django to allow requests from different domains. Now we're told here that we must set at least one of the three following settings. So we must learn about these three settings. They're the most important. Cores allow origins, cores allowed origins regexes, or cores allowed all origins. Right, so what we want to do here then, you can see if we move down slightly, it says cores allowed origins. So we can actually specify which origins will be able to make requests to our server if they're not the same origin as the actual server. So I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to move across back into my settings here, and I'm just going to remove the ones that aren't relevant, and we're just going to add the ones that are relevant. So what I need to do here is just quickly find out and remind ourselves the port number that we're currently using for our React application, which is 5173. And then we can just go ahead and add that in. There we go. So we'll then turn the servers on. There we go. And then we do it again. So we refresh the page. And this time you'll notice we don't get any cores problems. But what we do have is we've returned some data. And you can see that the data that we've actually returned is related to the server. So we have channel server, description, ID, name, and owner. So that's the data that correlates to the endpoint that we have requested data from. So we've now created an example of how to actually send a request from our React application over to Django DRF in this case. But regardless of Django DRF, if you're using any other framework for your API backend, you would still need to configure cores. Cores is something that is independent of your API system. Remember, this is a technology that, as we're learning, is built into browsers. So this is something that is going to be commonplace regardless of whatever API system or framework that you're using. Now, you will find the code example for what we've just achieved there in this tutorial's resources. So if you want to download that independently, if you have had any problems, you can go ahead and just check out the code base at this point. In this project, we're going to try and build an approach, a reusable approach for when we use CRUD operations. So CRUD being create, return, update, delete, or the R being response sometimes, or it can be called different things. So we're going to try and, with the CRUD operations, build a reusable piece of code which we can use for multiple CRUD operations. The only differential here, the only dynamic part will need to be the actual URL that we're sending the request to. So we're going to need to pass in that URL into this reusable piece of code that we're going to build, and then actually return the data back to the component. Now, before we get into all of that, in the next tutorial, I'm just going to give you some more information regarding CORS to give you a better overview of CORS before we then move into building our CRUD code, and as well as looking at more advanced features of Axios.